From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Kristen Amiot. It's Thursday, October 2, 2025. Mushroom killer Erin Patterson has a new lawyer. Prominent human rights barrister Julian McMahon SC will take up the case as the mother of two prepares to fight her convictions for murder and attempted murder. Patterson was convicted of killing 3 elderly relatives and attempting to kill another by feeding them beef Wellington laced with death cap mushrooms at a family lunch in 2023. State and territory leaders are in revolt over proposed funding changes to the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Premiers from across the country say they were blindsided by the overhaul, and they've blasted the federal government for leaving public hospitals in a tight spot. Those stories are live right now at theaustralian.com.au. Beijing has it out for BHP. The Chinese government has reportedly slapped a ban on iron ore from its mines in Western Australia in hopes of getting a better deal on exports. And it's got the bean counters in Canberra worried. Today, North Asia correspondent Will Glasgow joins me to unpack why China is playing hardball on steel production. Every now and then in this job, you hear a number that absolutely breaks your brain. Today, it's this.
Australia's iron ore trade, our exports of iron ore to China are so enormous. They're worth $100 billion. That's 1/5 in every export dollar Australia makes to the whole world.
Will Glasgow is the Australian's North Asia correspondent.
Nothing comes close to it. Nothing keeps the Australian Treasury up at night like this trade. And actually, nothing has been so comforting for the Australian Treasury for the last 2 decades as this incredibly lucrative trade.
China's been frustrated about the dominance of Australian iron ore in the market for decades, and now Beijing has dramatically upped the stakes in the fight for a better price.
Shareholder nerves very high today as Beijing digs up trouble for BHP and Australia's largest export commodity. There are reports China has banned purchases of iron ore cargoes from the company's mines in WA.
It's very much a work in progress, right, where this all lands. But what is totally clear is there's very, very forceful negotiations going on right now, and they've got pretty ugly. The Chinese want to pay less and get BHP to agree to longer-term contracts at lower prices than BHP wants to sell it for. BHP and the other iron ore companies have always, their response has been, let the market determine it. Now, again, because of just how oversized Australia is as a producer and China is as a buyer, the international iron ore trade basically is set by what China pays for Australian iron ore. That's the key determinant, and everything else cascades from that. So what the Chinese are clearly trying to do, they've created this company. It's like probably one of the most powerful companies no one ever heard of before in Australia. It's called the China Mineral Resources Group. And if you haven't heard of them, you're in very good company. But it was created by the Chinese a couple of years ago. It's their attempt to consolidate the buying that China does. So instead of having them all negotiate separately their contracts with the Australian players, they want the Australians to have to negotiate through this one point of contact. It's got clear oversight from Beijing, and Beijing thinks, its policymakers think, if we do this in a smarter way, we can use our buying power to get better terms for China.
A handful of big Australian miners export iron ore to China. There's BHP, Rio Tinto, Fortescue and Hancock. Vale from Brazil is our next biggest competitor.
So they picked BHP as the test case, and they want to try to break BHP or reset the price with BHP. If they're successful, well, after BHP, you betcha they'll be coming for Rio. They'll be coming for Vale, the big Brazilian third player, and they'll be coming for Fortescue and Hancock, right? Now, the flip of that is Rio, Fortescue, Vale, Hancock, they will all be in BHP's corner hoping that they can withstand this from the Chinese and not buckle to this and just hold on that principle that let the market determine it. The other thing that hangs over all this that's interesting is towards the end of the year, soon, finally some iron ore is going to come on the market from this big project. It's been called the Pilbara Killer. I think that's a bit hyperbolic, but this big project in the west of Africa, in Guinea. And that project is a joint venture between Rio Tinto and a big Chinese state-owned company. Now, the Chinese idea with that project is if they can bring the iron ore from that project into the world supply, ultimately, most of that's going into China, they can then increase the amount of iron ore in the world, and the laws of supply and demand mean the price will come down. That's what they hope. So it's all part of this systemic effort by China to give itself more options and erode that market dominance that the Australian companies have had.
To understand how we got here, you've got to go back to the mid-2000s, when the global economy was in turmoil.
In-depth coverage now on the growing financial crisis.
It was a manic Monday in the financial market. The Dow tumbled more than 500 points after two pillars.
What the heck is going on down here? I don't know.
And that is the largest single-day point loss ever.
China tried to rescue its economy through a massive stimulus package that focused on construction. To build, you need steel, and to make steel, you need iron ore. Enter Australia.
China had the bazooka response, this enormous stimulus effort within China, and Australia benefited like no other economy in the world. But what it did was they built a lot of stuff. It was very much an infrastructure-led policy, and it required mountains and mountains of iron ore, almost 2/3 of which came from Australia. So it was during the Rudd government, around 2010, this thing blew up at the anger from the Chinese. If you remember, there was an executive at Rio Tinto, Stern Hu, a Chinese-Australian, who got detained and imprisoned in China.
Businessman Stern Hu has been sentenced to 10 years jail. A court in Shanghai found him guilty of accepting bribes and stealing commercial secrets while head of Rio Tinto's iron ore operations in China.
But look, the ins and outs of that case, put that to one side. What was absolutely unambiguous about that was behind it all was this fury from China. They were paying so much for this trade. And they know all of these companies release their data so everyone can see what the costs of getting this product out of the ground is in Western Australia. And say in the BHP case, they can now produce iron ore in the Pilbara for about $20 a ton. China right now, in this moment of fury, is paying more than $100 a ton. So the profit on this trade is bonkers. And that's happening in a world where China's real estate sector is in a historic slump. And it's 4 years into that. And also in a world where Chinese state-backed steel industry is losing a lot of money. A lot of them are unprofitable. So the Chinese system just cannot believe what is going on in this world where our end is losing so much money, but the Australian end is just creaming us.
Can China's steel production industry, and by extension its economy, actually survive without Australian iron ore in the mix if this does hold?
Yeah, well, it certainly can't indefinitely, right, unless China wants to give away some of its share of the steel industry. And look, frankly, much of the world would cheer that on. I mean, they're upset because they are so reliant on iron ore, but that's because they've got us into a world where more than half of the world's steel is made in China by Chinese state-owned companies. And that's continuing even 4 years into this epic, historic property slump in China. So a lot of people thought following the slump, the steel industry in China would contract. Instead, it's plateaued. It's been a really extraordinary development. So, I mean, I think one of the reasons the Chinese are able to do this right now is if there's a bit of slack in their steel making, the Chinese economy can get by because, frankly, it's been a bit peculiar. How on earth have they continued to produce at such levels? People in the big miners and the Australian government scratch their heads about that. They've continued to buy, so clearly they're finding a use for it, but it has been a bit strange. Everyone in the Chinese steel sector is very frank that these are not good times. I think they're trying to use that crisis to get some progress on this just because there just isn't such screeching demand at all for iron ore in the steel industry at the moment. You know, we'll see. High stakes.
Coming up, what a fight over iron ore means for Australia-China relations. Asked about a ban reportedly slapped on Australian iron ore by Beijing, Anthony Albanese said he's not mad, just disappointed.
Well, I am concerned about that. And of course, we have seen those issues in the past. I want to see Australian iron ore be able to be exported into China without hindrance.
Here's Will Glasgow.
Quite naturally, when something like this happens, people think, what's it linked to in the bilateral relationship, right? And China's trained us all to think that way. I mean, they're so political. They're very comfortable, as we in Australia know very, very well, with linking political diplomatic disputes with trade and trying to use trade or access to China as a reward for what they would call good or acceptable behaviour. But look, that is a real dynamic. China does do that, but they also, all the while, are making rational decisions on what's best for the Chinese economy. So if we go back, we did a spectacular experiment in Australia with Chinese trade policy and use of trade coercion from 2020 to, well, it only ended officially actually at the start of this year, 2025. But in the real peak of this thing, when China was putting coercive measures on various Australian products, they never touched iron ore. They never touched LNG. Those were the two that were absolutely off limits from the Chinese all the way through. And that was when they were furious with the Australian government. Why is that? Well, they don't have options. You know, Brazil doesn't produce enough. If they blocked Australian iron ore, wow, they'd pay a lot for Brazilian iron ore because it's the only other substantial producer of the stuff. But the Brazilians already can't produce it as cheaply and get it to China as the Australians can. So they could only do that by taxing themselves hugely, essentially. All this is happening as in Chinese state media right now, they are putting up Australia as the poster child for other Five Eyes countries, particularly Canada. They've just blocked canola and rapeseed from Canada. They've been the biggest buyer of Canadian canola and rapeseed. And there's reports that they've finally, after years of blacklisting Australian rapeseed, they've just started buying Australian canola. And it looks, all the reports are signalling that to punish Canada for high tariffs they put on Chinese EVs, they're going after Canadian agricultural exporters. Back in 2020, Australia's farmers were losing out to Canada, to America, to all other agricultural traders. This time around, Australia's the one benefiting from that.
Will Glasgow is the Australian's North Asia correspondent. You can read his reporting right now at theaustralian.com.au.